And well, you described John too. After Paul, you switched to John. How come John wore off a bit for you?
Well, the more I learned about John Lennon through the research of the book, the further and further, the closer I got to him actually first, and then the further and further I got from him. It's very easy to like John when you're researching him because in a story like the Beatles, John is the dark edge to the Beatles, which you really need in a band like that. He was haunted by demons, even as a young boy.
And because of his mom and dad?
Because of his mother and father, they rejected him at an early age. And of course, when he learned to love his mother again, she was taken away from him because she was killed in a car accident. The same thing happened with his friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who was his best friend, probably the biggest influence in his life other than Paul McCartney. And of course, Stuart died of a brain aneurysm and was taken from John. And I think John felt that everybody who he loved was taken away from him. He was also in a loveless marriage. And this made him a very interesting character to me. He was very deep, very dark. He shot from the hip. He said whatever he wanted to say at any time without thinking too much about it, which makes him very interesting. But John was dark. You know, he drank a lot. He took a lot of drugs. He hurt people at times, and he didn't like being a Beatle, which you know, it annoyed me in the middle of the story. So I lost my interest with John Lennon as well.
And while you were saying, do you feel some sympathy for John Lennon?
I feel great sympathy for John. John was someone who was very frustrated by his life. He was a very, very creative man. And he always felt that there was nobody to nurture his creativity. And so it made him angry. And I understand that. I felt the same way in my life. I was a creative person, and I was on my own for most of the time. And I understand exactly John's anger and John's demons. I didn't take them to that extent in my life. I didn't do a lot of drugs. I didn't drink myself into a stupor at night and have fights with people. But, you know, that's what made John who he is. Look, we have to understand one thing about John Lennon. John Lennon created the Beatles. It was his idea. He came up with the name for the Beatles. Paul held them together musically, but John held them together from a leader's standpoint. In the beginning, this was John Lennon's band. Even Paul looked up to him. And then very soon it became Paul McCartney's band. And that's when things started to fall apart.
And then George Harrison?
Well, you know, George is an interesting guy. George was a very uneducated guy. He didn't learn anything in school. He had no interest in school. He, what they called sagged off school with a friend. They went to the movies every day. And when it came time to take his exams, he failed every one of them. And yet, at the end of his life, George is a man who is just interested in learning all he can about Eastern philosophy, about world peace, about people's interaction. So in my book, you get to see George Harrison make an amazing arc, not just as a musician, but as a human being. And that I found fascinating about George. At the same point, George was the Beatle who had the wandering eye. George was with other women more than all the other Beatles. George was the one person of the Beatles, everyone thought it was John, but it was really George who could level someone with the wrong comment, who could hurt somebody at the wrong time by saying what he felt, indiscriminately. And I don't feel that George was a very interesting guitar player. Excuse me, I felt that Paul was a much more interesting guitar player than George was. So by the time I finished all this research, Ringo was staring me at the face.
And